This country doesn't make sense. It has pristine nature, horrific wildfires, and is one of the richest countries with some of the best renewable resources in the world.
We don't say hello, we say g'day, because here, every day is a good day.
But despite having an easier job stopping climate change than most, and way more reason to do so, Australians are among the world's worst polluters. Their historical emissions are higher than the citizens of all but 2 countries. They're lobbying worse than most, and their ambitions weaker. So how did Australia become a climate villain? And can it clean up its act? Now let's be clear from the start. Australia isn't alone in its love for fossil fuels. In 2023, Germany tore down a whole village so a company could dig up coal. And yeah, countries like the US and China have their own big problems too. But 3 things make Australia particularly weird. The first is that it's hit so much harder by climate change than most of the rich world. It's home to the Great Barrier Reef, which hotter seas are set to wipe out this century. And it's suffered horrific wildfires and floods one after another. The second reason is that Australia should be an easy country to turn green. The country of just 26 million people is the 13th biggest economy in the world. It has some of the world's most skilled engineers and tradespeople. And it has loads of sun, wind and water to power itself cleanly. The third strange thing is that Australia's climate efforts haven't kept pace with other rich countries.
Australia has said it aims to cut its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050.
That announcement only came in 2021, after pressure from allies like the UK and US, and it wasn't backed up by an actual plan. To understand Australia's climate policy, you have to understand its economy, which was built on mining its resources and shipping them to East Asia and the US. First, the government stole swathes of land from indigenous Australians and claimed rights to the minerals buried underneath. Then it leased the land to companies and charged them to dig up the resources. That tied the country's wealth to its mines early on. A big part of that was coal. Just 2 decades ago, Australia made 80% of its electricity from coal. Today, that share is still around 50%. That's twice as much as the US burns and 25 times more than the UK. But the fuel it burns at home isn't the only problem. Australia also exports more coal than any country except Indonesia. And all that shows in its politics.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
That was former Prime Minister Scott Morrison in 2017. This is Tony Abbott, another former Prime Minister, 3 years earlier.
Coal is good for humanity.
For the last decade, a coalition of Conservative parties pushed coal-friendly policies and pushed back on basic climate science. They were kicked out in 2022, giving Australia a chance to finally clean up its act. Now, things have certainly changed, but the ambitions of the new centre-left government also fall short, and we'll come back to exactly how later in the video. But it was the actions of the old lot that gave Australia the reputation as a climate villain.
When we turn up to international meetings, we always get the wooden spoon. We're always called out as a laggard.
This is Kate Crowley. She studied Australia's climate policy over the last decades.
Our policy positions, if you read between the lines, they're always, well, we'll do anything but actually cut emissions. We'll do anything but actually reduce the amount of coal we're exporting. We'll do anything but make a proper transition.
The most obvious reason for Australia's slow progress is its coal, oil and gas industries, and the power its lobbyists wield over politicians and media. One business lobby group reportedly had the audacity to call itself the Greenhouse Mafia as early as the 1990s because of the influence it wielded on politics. A former speechwriter to an environment minister documented how the group sat on environment committees where they dictated Australian climate policy for decades. When governments tried to price carbon and tax the profits of mining companies, business leaders applied pressure to politicians. And at the same time, they swayed public opinion with interesting marketing schemes.
If the price of coal goes up,
Then there was a revolving door between the energy industry and politics. A study from the Grattan Institute think tank found there was substantial movement between ministerial officers and lobbying roles in the energy and resources sectors. It found that more than 1/3 of all lobbyists were former government officials. And, to make matters worse, Australia has some of the weakest political finance laws among rich countries. In the last election, unidentified political donors gave the big parties more than 90 million Australian dollars. Now, this money comes from donors with all sorts of interests. But what's outrageous is that Australians have no idea which industries are buying influence.
It's very difficult to disentangle that level of influence. You'd have to do something about strengthening political lobbying laws and political donation laws for a start.
Now, for a country burned so badly by extreme weather, it seems strange that people haven't demanded these governments stand up to the fossil fuel industry. But there is a good reason for this. A partisan media with one side downplaying climate change.
First, have a look at this fear-mongering from the Climate Council.
Are you sure Australia's emissions really could make a difference?
This doesn't mean we deny climate change or we deny that some action shouldn't be taken, but it does. This study does disprove the idea that we're living in a catastrophe already.
A surprisingly large chunk of Australian media is in the hands of one powerful man. The three biggest newspapers are owned by Rupert Murdoch, the 91-year-old media mogul behind Fox News in the US. His company News Corp Australia also owns a TV channel, Sky News Australia. They pushed the industry's agenda so hard they even went after conservative politicians who were moderate on climate change.
The campaign on climate denial is just staggering.
That was former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who was ousted by his own party after trying to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Murdoch's papers have historically sowed doubt about scientific facts and attacked policies that could cut pollution. One study found 45% of its articles about climate change between April 2019 and March 2020 were sceptical of the science or rejected it. And their coverage of policies to stop global warming was twice as likely to be negative than positive. Things have started to change, at least a bit. In 2020, Rupert Murdoch's youngest son James called out his father's media empire for climate denial as bushfires ravaged Australia, and then he quit. A year later, the company surprised everyone with a campaign to highlight the benefits of cutting emissions.
News Corp papers unveiled a bold new editorial position this morning with a 16-page wraparound urging action on climate change.
So the company is moving away from open climate denial, but is still pushing to delay action. One argument that has worked particularly well is the idea that fighting climate change will cost Australian jobs. Australia is home to some of the world's biggest mining companies. The industry makes up about 10% of the country's GDP, and politicians, journalists and business executives shout about this loudly.
The proposed scheme is already threatening future contracts, putting the jobs of 500 staff at risk.
Without capital, there's no projects. Without projects, there's no jobs. So
they're not about to trade off their jobs any more than we are.
Finding new jobs for fossil fuel workers is important. But the role that coal, oil and gas play is way smaller than Australians think.
This perception that fossil fuels are really crucial to the Australian economy in terms of jobs is fundamental in sort of the narrative against climate action, but really, it doesn't really stack up in practical terms.
This is climate analyst Sumitri Venkatesubramanian. She found Australians overestimate the size of gas and oil industry employment by a factor of 58. It's a similar story for coal. People think coal mining makes up 13% of GDP. It's actually 10 times less. The weird thing here is that not only does Australia have enough sun and wind to make loads of renewable energy, it also has huge deposits of minerals that are key to cleaning up economies, like copper and lithium. And despite all the denial, Australians are pretty supportive of stopping climate change. Which, given the fires and floods and droughts that they're living through, maybe isn't so surprising. The Australian Institute study found 75% of Australians are concerned about climate change. 79% want to phase out coal plants.
Those are some pretty large figures that show the opinions of Australians that maybe doesn't stack up so much with this idea that Australians on the whole are climate deniers.
That mindset played a big role in the last election. The ruling Conservative coalition lost votes in wealthy areas of big cities to the Teals, a network of independent candidates who promised more climate action. That helped the traditional centre-left party win the election. The new government has set a target to cut emissions 43% by 2030 from their 2005 levels. Now, these targets are still too weak to stop the planet heating 1.5 degrees Celsius, the level world leaders said they tried to aim for, but it would get it down to about 2 degrees. But despite its higher ambition, the new government has two big problems. The first is the number of fossil fuel projects it plans to build.
Australia has 117 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline. And so if those get approved, if those go through, that's going to blow all of our emissions, over any limit that we set.
But the bigger problem is the reliance on carbon offsets to clean up the economy. The government wants to make industry emit less CO2 for each good it produces. The limit will shrink about 5% each year. But instead of forcing companies to pollute less, the government's letting some of them buy certificates that say they've avoided pollution elsewhere, a lot of the time by planting trees or protecting forests. The problem, though, is that the market for these certificates is badly regulated and full of junk offsets that don't actually cut emissions. You can learn more about the problems in this video here. And Australia's plans are just far weaker than the EU's rules, which don't allow forest offsets in its emissions trading system and limit the total number that can be used.
There's no requirement that they can't start new projects. They can keep polluting, they can keep expanding, they can keep increasing their emissions. As long as they buy offsets, that's totally fine.
Still, Australia is cleaning up its energy system. Cheap renewable energy is displacing fossil fuels, even where policy is weak. And even where the federal government has been slow, some states have moved fast. Queensland and Victoria are getting out of coal. Tasmania's electricity grid is already 100% renewable, and it wants to generate double its needs from clean energy by 2040. Australia's reputation as a climate villain makes sense. It's fought policies to clean up the economy, lobbyists and journalists have kept it hooked on fossil fuels, but its people want change, and that's something that's starting to show. Every country has a story to tell about climate change, but Australia's is one of the weirdest. So let us know in the comments who you think we should take a look at next.